Have you ever wondered how two nations, once fierce enemies locked in a brutal war, could one day stand side by side as close friends? Today, I want to share with you the powerful story of the war between the United States and Japan, a story of conflict, loss, and, most importantly, healing and hope. Today, I want to tell you a story about two nations far across the oceans from one another, who found themselves in the middle of something very difficult. It's the story of the war between the United States and Japan. Once upon a time, there were tensions growing between these two countries. Japan was seeking to grow and expand, and it started moving into places where others already lived. United States, seeing this, became very concerned and decided to stop sharing certain things Japan needed, like oil and important materials. This made Japan very upset. Then, one quiet Sunday morning, something very unexpected happened. Japan sent airplanes across the sea, and they attacked a place called Pearl Harbor. It was sudden and very painful. Many lives were lost that day, and it was a moment that changed everything. After that, both countries were at war. Battles were fought on islands surrounded by deep blue water. The fighting was fierce, and many people on both sides were scared and hurt. Each battle brought more loss, and it seemed like peace was far away. The United States decided to slowly take back islands, one at a time, in what they called island hopping. It was a hard and long journey. People showed great bravery, but also faced great sorrow. In the summer of 1945, something very serious happened. Two powerful bombs were dropped on cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was enormous, and many people were lost. It was a moment of deep sadness for the world. After all that pain, Japan surrendered. The war ended, and something very important happened after that. Instead of staying enemies, the two countries worked together to rebuild. They started learning from each other. They found new ways to grow in peace. This story reminds us that even after the hardest battles, there can be hope. People can change. Countries can become friends again. Japan had long desired to expand its empire across Asia. Driven by the need for natural resources such as oil, rubber, and metals, which were essential for its growing industries and military power. In the early 1930s, Japan invaded Manchuria and later launched a full-scale war against China in 1937. Leading to the brutal conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan's actions alarmed Western nations, especially the United States, which had economic interests and allies in Asia. The US strongly opposed Japan's aggression and, over time, began imposing a series of economic sanctions and trade restrictions to pressure Japan to withdraw from China and other occupied regions. These sanctions grew harsher, culminating in a complete oil embargo in 1941. Oil was the lifeblood of Japan's military forces, and the embargo threatened to cripple its Navy and Air Force operations. Japan saw the embargo as a direct threat to its survival and imperial ambitions. Japanese leaders believed they had two options: they withdraw from China and Southeast Asia, or secure new sources of oil and resources through military force. They chose the latter. Japanese military strategy revolved around taking control of resource-rich areas such as the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. But they feared that the US Pacific Fleet, based at Pearl Harbor, could interfere with their plans. To prevent American interference, Japan devised a surprise attack that would weaken the US fleet and buy time for Japan to seize territories. This decision was driven by a belief that a quick, decisive strike could force the United States to negotiate peace on Japan's terms. The build-up to the war was marked by failed negotiations, deep mistrust, and clashing ambitions. Each step pushed both nations closer to war, with neither side willing to back down from their goals. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise military attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, located in Hawaii. The attack was carefully planned by the Japanese military to deliver a swift and devastating blow to the US Pacific Fleet, which was seen as the main obstacle to Japan's expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. More than 350 Japanese aircraft, including bombers, torpedo planners, and fighter planes, took part in the assault. They attacked in 2 waves, targeting battleships, airfields, and other military installations. The strike was sudden, catching the American forces completely off guard. Within just a few hours, several American battleships were sunk or severely damaged, including the USS Arizona, which exploded and sank, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 sailors. In total, more than 2,400 Americans, including civilians, were killed, and many others were wounded. The damage extended beyond ships, as nearly 200 American aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. The Japanese believed that by crippling the Pacific Fleet, they could prevent the United States from interfering in their plans to take control of territories rich in oil and resources. They hoped the shock of the attack would discourage the United States from entering the war. However, the attack had the opposite effect. News of the devastation quickly spread across the country, stirring anger and uniting Americans in support of entering the war. The following day, on December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan, marking its official entry into World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor became one of the most defining moments in American history, symbolizing both the vulnerability of the nation and its resolve to fight back against aggression with determination and unity. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the war between the United States and Japan spread across the Pacific, leading to a series of intense and brutal battles. Japan quickly advanced through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing territories like the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. These victories gave Japan control over vast resources and strategic locations. However, the tide of the war began to shift after the Battle of Midway in June 1942. During this critical battle, the United States Navy dealt a crushing blow to Japan's naval power by sinking 4 of its aircraft carriers, which were central to Japan's offensive operations. This victory marked the turning point in the Pacific War, as it stopped Japan's expansion and placed them on the defensive. Following Midway, the United States launched a campaign to recapture islands under Japanese control. The battles were often fought in harsh conditions, with dense jungles, rough seas, and determined defenders. One of the earliest and most important campaigns was the Battle of Guadalcanal, which lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. It involved fierce fighting on land, at sea, and in the air. Gradually, U.S. forces began pushing Japanese troops back through a strategy known as island hopping, where they would seize certain key islands and bypass others, isolating Japanese forces. The fighting grew even more intense as American forces approached Japan's home islands. Battles such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa were marked by high casualties on both sides, as Japanese troops fiercely resisted surrender. Kamikaze attacks became more common during this phase, with Japanese pilots deliberately crashing their planes into American ships. Each battle brought the United States closer to Japan's mainland, but also showed how determined and desperate the fighting had become in the Pacific theater of World War II. The island hopping strategy, also known as leapfrogging, became the central military approach used by the United States in the Pacific War against Japan. After the turning point at the Battle of Midway, American military leaders realized that capturing every Japanese-held island would take too much time and cost too many lives. Instead, they devised a plan to selectively target strategically important islands and bypass heavily fortified ones. The idea was to seize islands that could be turned into airfields or naval bases, allowing the U.S. forces to cut off supplies and reinforcements to Japanese troops stationed on nearby islands. By doing so, isolated Japanese forces would become powerless and ineffective over time. This strategy allowed American forces to steadily move across the Pacific, getting closer to Japan's home islands with each victory. One of the early examples of island hopping was the capture of Guadalcanal, followed by campaigns in the Solomon Islands and the Gilbert Islands. The Battle of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands was particularly brutal, showing how determined Japanese troops were to defend every inch of territory. Despite fierce resistance, American forces continued advancing through the Marshall Islands and the Mariana Islands, capturing Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the Marianas was especially significant because it placed Japan within range of American long-range bombers, including the B-29 Superfortress, which would later be used to bomb Japanese cities. Each island battle was fought under harsh conditions, with extreme heat, disease, and rugged terrain making combat even more difficult. Japanese defenders often fought to the death, refusing to surrender, which increased the cost of each victory. For the Americans, the island-hopping strategy gradually brought US forces to Japan's doorstep, setting the stage for the final, most intense battles of the Pacific War, and placing the Japanese mainland within striking distance of devastating air attacks. In the summer of 1945, after years of brutal fighting in the Pacific, the United States faced a difficult decision on how to bring the war with Japan to an end. Despite suffering heavy losses and losing control of much of its territory, Japan refused to surrender. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had shown how fiercely Japanese forces would fight to defend their homeland, with many soldiers and civilians choosing death over surrender. American military leaders feared that a full-scale invasion of Japan would result in enormous casualties on both sides. At the same time, the United States had developed a powerful new weapon, the atomic bomb, through a secret project called the Manhattan Project. This bomb had the ability to destroy entire cities with a single strike. Hoping to avoid a long and costly invasion, US leaders decided to use the atomic bomb to force Japan's surrender. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion instantly destroyed much of the city, killing tens of thousands of people and leaving many more suffering from severe burns and radiation sickness. Despite the devastation, Japan did not immediately surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, causing similar destruction and loss of life. These bombings shocked the world and demonstrated the terrifying power of nuclear weapons. In addition to the bombings, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched an invasion of Japanese-occupied territories in Asia. Adding further pressure, faced with overwhelming destruction and the threat of more atomic attacks, Japan finally agreed to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender, and the official signing of the surrender documents took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. Ending World War II. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the world entered a new chapter. Japan's cities were in ruins, and its economy was shattered. The United States took on the responsibility of overseeing Japan's reconstruction through an occupation. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, this occupation lasted from 1945 to 1952, and aimed to rebuild Japan as a peaceful and democratic nation. One of the first steps was disarming Japan's military and ensuring it could never wage war again. The US also worked to change Japan's political system. A new constitution was introduced in 1947, which included strong protections for democracy, individual rights, and women's rights. One of its most important parts was Article 9, in which Japan renounced war and promised never to maintain military forces for conflict again. Alongside political reforms, economic changes were introduced. The US worked to dismantle large industrial groups called Zaibatsu, which had dominated Japan's economy before and during the war. Land reforms allowed many tenant farmers to own the land they worked, reducing poverty and increasing fairness in society. Education systems were also reformed, promoting critical thinking and democratic values. During this period, Japan also faced serious food shortages, and the US provided food aid to help prevent widespread hunger. Over time, Japan's industries were rebuilt, and its economy began to grow rapidly. The scars of war slowly healed. As Japan became known not for its military power but for its technological achievements and peaceful diplomacy, the friendship between the United States and Japan grew stronger, eventually turning into a close alliance. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan had transformed into a democratic nation with a commitment to peace. The painful history of war gave way to a new era focused on cooperation, rebuilding, and learning from the past to ensure a more hopeful future. The story of the war between the United States and Japan is one filled with deep pain, great struggles, and lasting lessons. It reminds us how quickly disagreements between nations can grow into something devastating, affecting millions of lives. From the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, to the fierce battles across the Pacific, and finally to the destruction caused by atomic bombs, the war showed both the darkness of conflict and the resilience of people. But what followed after the war is just as important to remember. Two nations that once stood as enemies found a way to rebuild. Not through more fighting, but through understanding, cooperation, and shared hope for peace. This story teaches that even after the hardest battles, healing is possible, and new beginnings can rise from even the darkest times. It is a reminder that peace is always worth working toward, and kindness, even after conflict, can change the world. Asterisk.